The strange part about that evening wasn't the wedding. It wasn't the music, or the decorations, or the hundreds of guests filling the hall with conversation. It was the moment the groom's father suddenly stopped eating and stared at me like he had just seen a ghost. Just seconds earlier, my stepsister had introduced me to everyone at the table, with a smile that looked sweet on the outside, but sharp underneath. "This is my stepsister," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. Then she laughed lightly and added, "She's just a nurse." A few people at the table chuckled politely. I kept my smile. I didn't argue. I had learned a long time ago that defending myself in front of Lily only made things worse. But then the groom's father slowly leaned forward. His eyes narrowed as he studied my face carefully. And he said something that changed the entire evening. "Wait a second." The room grew quieter. "Aren't you the nurse who—" He stopped mid-sentence. And suddenly, everyone at the table was looking at me. "My name is Sarah Collins. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a hospital nurse. It's not the kind of job that attracts attention. Most days, the people you help don't even remember your face. But that never bothered me. Helping people during the worst moments of their lives has always felt meaningful to me." Lily, my stepsister, saw life very differently. We grew up in the same house after our parents married when we were teenagers. But our worlds were never the same. Lily loved status, appearances, expensive things. She went to elite schools and traveled often. I worked part-time through college and eventually earned my nursing license. I was proud of it, but Lily always treated it like it was small, like my career was something ordinary, something unimpressive. And her wedding that night was exactly the kind of event she loved. Elegant decorations, beautiful lights hanging from the ceiling, guests dressed in expensive suits and sparkling jewelry. I arrived quietly, carrying a small gift box. I didn't expect anyone to notice me, and honestly, I was fine with that. The reception hall was already buzzing when I walked in. Guests were laughing, talking, and greeting each other near long decorated tables. At the center of it all was Lily. She looked radiant in her white wedding dress, surrounded by friends and relatives. Her husband, Daniel, stood beside her greeting guests. I took a seat near the end of one table, hoping to blend into the background. For about 20 minutes, everything felt normal. Then Lily suddenly stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. The ringing sound cut through the room. "Everyone," she said brightly. "I want to introduce someone to Daniel's family." Her eyes turned toward me. My stomach tightened. "Sarah," she called. "Come here." Dozens of heads turned in my direction. I stood slowly and walked toward the main table. When I reached her, Lily placed a hand on my shoulder. Her smile looked warm, but I knew that smile. "This," she announced to the groom's relatives, "is my stepsister." Then she paused just long enough to draw attention, and laughed. "She's just a nurse." Several people chuckled politely. I simply smiled. Inside, though, the familiar sting of embarrassment settled quietly in my chest. The moment passed quickly. Conversation returned to normal. Plates clinked. People began eating again. I thought that would be the end of it. But then something strange happened. Across the table, Daniel's father stopped eating. He was a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes. And he was staring directly at me. Not casually, not politely, carefully, like someone searching his memory. For several minutes, he barely spoke. Daniel eventually noticed. "Dad," he asked, "everything okay?" The older man nodded slowly. Yes, I'm fine." But he kept looking at me, almost puzzled. Finally, he turned toward his son. "What did you say her name was?" "Sarah," Daniel replied. The man repeated it softly. "Sarah." Across the table, Lily waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about her," she laughed. "She practically lives inside hospitals." Some guests smiled awkwardly. But the groom's father didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and spoke to me directly. "I'm sorry," he said kindly. "Have we met before?" I hesitated. "I meet a lot of people through work," I said. "That's possible." Then he said something that made the table grow quiet again. "I feel like I saw you during a very important moment in my life. Right about here in the story. If moments like this ever remind you how unexpected life can be, don't forget to like the video. And where you're watching from, tell me in the comments. Because stories like this travel farther than we realize. About 20 minutes later, the music paused and guests returned to their seats. Daniel's father sat down again. But this time his expression looked different.
Certain.
He turned toward me slowly. Sarah, he said. Yes. 3 years ago, did you work at Riverside Medical Center? My heart skipped. Yes. He leaned back and exhaled deeply. I knew it. Daniel looked confused. Knew what? The older man turned toward his son. 3 years ago, he said quietly, I was in a terrible car accident. The table fell silent. I was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. He paused before continuing. That night, the roads were blocked and most of the doctors were delayed. He looked directly at me. For nearly 6 hours, one nurse stayed beside me. Then he pointed gently toward me. That nurse was her. The entire table went silent. Daniel stared at me. You saved my father? I shook my head slightly. I was doing my job. But the older man shook his head firmly. No. His voice grew stronger. You stayed with me when no one else could. You kept me awake, monitored my breathing, and made sure I didn't lose consciousness. He turned slowly toward Lily. You introduced her as just a nurse. The room was completely still. You should never say just a nurse about someone who saves lives. Lily's face lost all color. Daniel stood up and walked around the table toward me. Then he extended his hand. Thank you, he said sincerely. And I mean that. The music eventually started again. Conversations slowly returned. But something had clearly changed. The same people who barely noticed me earlier now looked at me with quiet respect. Meanwhile, Lily avoided looking at me for the rest of the evening. Not every moment of justice arrives with anger or revenge. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with truth. That night, an entire room learned something simple but powerful. Never underestimate someone because of their job, especially when that job is helping people survive their hardest moments. If stories like this remind you that kindness and humility still matter, consider subscribing, because sometimes the quietest people carry the most powerful stories.